témában a mai nap.
We'll move on our agenda. The next debate is on the human rights situation in the Kingdom of Bahrain, in particular the cases of death row inmates and human rights defenders. First, I would like to give the floor to Thomas Stywowski. You have the floor from Prague.
Zálivů, ať už v oblasti politických, ale...
Thank you. When it comes to politics, when it comes to economics, relations between the European Union and the Kingdom of Bahrain, when it comes to human rights, there's a very lively, intense debate going on. And we can say that there have been some developments, for instance, in the field of education, that can be noted. But what about women's rights? These are still problematic. I think it would be appropriate for us to delve deeper into these questions, and we must do this through dialogue. That's the only way of improving upon the situation. We need to look at the facts as they are, to know these facts. Here, what we're talking about is looking at the kinds of relations that we could have with this country, and also the relationship between this country and other countries, neighbouring countries, and of course human rights. What I believe we need to do is react. If there are verifiable facts, we must react, and we must put the pressure on in order for things to change. We have before this House a resolution concerning the human rights situation in the Kingdom of Bahrain. In connection with that, I think it's safe to say that the situation is not ideal. That said, there is pressure. This resolution, for instance, is one instrument of pressure, and I think that it could be helpful in terms of moving forward. That said, there are points that we still need to discuss. Yes, we are being critical vis-à-vis our partners on some points, but let's also be honest, we're not perfect ourselves. Therefore, what can we do? If we want to improve the human rights situation, we need to be systematic, and we need to also act in accordance with the law.
Kiitokset kollega Stywowski.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mark Tarabella. A minute and a half.
Depuis 2011,
since 2011, following the peaceful rising of the Bahraini people, the authorities have carried out severe repression against the freedoms of the population, in particular the right to demonstrate peacefully. In February 2021, many children were arrested, having taken part in demonstrations commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring. 3 of them are still detained at the moment. Add to that the death penalty and executions and unfair trials. We could also add the dissolution of many of the opposition parties, peaceful parties, for example Al-Wefaq, and the persecution of public personalities for their activities on social networks. It is our duty to continue our work to encourage the country to take measures that move towards respect of human rights. And I address you, the High Representative, Mr. Borrell. Bahrain and other countries use the dialogue with the EU on human rights as proof, if you like, that their governments respect human rights. But we know that that's not the case, and we need to pay particular attention to not falling into the trap of that kind of discourse, because we need a dialogue, yes, but where the dialogue is not followed up by actions, it's not productive. So my hope is that there will be a dialogue followed up by concrete actions.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is José Ramón Bauza Diaz. A minute and a half.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. From this podium and on behalf of Renew, I would like to express very, very explicitly to the authorities in Bahrain and more specifically to the ruler of the Kingdom of Bahrain that they look very carefully at the possibility of a moratorium on the types of punishment that exist, capital punishment. I think this very, very cruel type of capital punishment that takes place is something which goes contrary to the developments, contrary to moving forward in the Middle East, and also the execution or the pending execution of 2 human rights activists. Imagine the instability that this will result in. Why execute these individuals when one is trying to show to the world that there is a possibility for development in the Middle East and for progress, with new possibilities as far as resolving the crises, the problems that exist in Israel as well. It's absolutely imperative to move forward on the human rights front, and we all are members, or we all have to participate in this particular process as well. So it must be heard loud and clear that the moment has come to correct this error as far as the decisions that have been made with regard to capital punishment in the defense and the protection, in the name of the protection of human rights. And indeed, we as Europeans ought to push forward on this particular front. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ernest Urtasun. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, in the aftermath of the Bahraini Arab Spring uprising, Bahrain authorities continue to violate and restrict fundamental freedoms. Human rights lawyers, journalists and political activists face ongoing systematic targeting, and no political opposition is tolerated. The situation of the human rights defenders, and women particularly, are extremely worrying. Bahrain has continued to execute people despite the 2017 moratorium on the death penalty, and 27 persons are currently on the death row, being subject to extreme psychological suffering and inhumane conditions in prisons. In our resolution, we strongly call on the Bahraini authorities to halt their execution immediately and to commute their sentences. This includes releasing all human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience, and to drop all charges against them. The EU and its member states should continue to put pressure on the authorities to ensure the respect for human rights as part of any enhanced EU cooperation with the country. Thank you so much.
Kiitos.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is our colleague Ryszard Czarnecki.
Pani Przewodnicząca, Pani Komisarz.
Madam President, Madam Commissioner, I was in Bahrain. I have been there several times, but it's not enough for me to say that I know this country, but it is enough to claim that I know what's going on there. And I agree with the co-authors of the resolution, with Mr. Zdechowski from EPP. We see clear progress on the way towards democratization, a larger share of women's participation in political life in the parliament. We should also recognize the progress in education. But of course, there are still problems. And it is good that we are trying to talk about them within a dialogue with the Kingdom of Bahrain. Our cooperation is very much needed in order to promote common values, which are anyway more promoted there in some other Arab country.
Kiitos, kollega.
Thank you very much. I now pass the floor to Miguel Urban Crespo. You have the floor.
Gracias,
Thank you, Madam. 10 years after the popular rising in Bahrain, persecution has intensified. There's no space for freedom of expression. People are accused of terrorism based on testimonies obtained under torture. In the same time, the EU is giving funds to strengthen the judicial system, which is making these accusations. The violence is crucial to the assassination of the Yemeni civil society. The Commission has a cooperation agreement and member states sign defence agreements. If human rights are as important as is said, then the granting of funds should be conditioned by respect for human rights, and there should be an arms embargo. Geopolitical interests and commercial interests seem to be much more a priority than the human and social rights of the Bahraini people.
Paljon kiitos, kollega Miguel.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to our colleague Thierry Mariani. You have the floor.
10 years down the road from the Arab Spring, what can we see? Disaster, humanitarian disaster in Syria, a crisis in Bahrain. But in fact, the EU has allowed the Gulf Council, in other words, Saudi Arabia, deploy its tanks in the capital of this country. It's not in the press. It's not led to any closures of embassies of the European Union. Most of the protesters were Shiites, and they were therefore accused of being aligned with Iran. The world just turned away, turned a blind eye. Bahrain is still an exception on the Arab Peninsula. It's more tolerant than many of its countries, in fact. The erection of a vast Catholic cathedral is a sign of that. There's a great contradiction going on. It's very open in some areas as a country and very closed in others. This is why I think the EU should change its approach towards the Arab Peninsula. We shouldn't just have a one-size-fits-all policy. We should have one that is balanced, and I think the Bahraini example shows that.
Kiitokset, kollega Maria.
Thank you very much. And now we move to the interventions of individual speakers after the rapporteurs. I'm sorry, I give the floor to the groups. And Krzysztof Hetman is the first one.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much, President, Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. It is by violence and enforced and the executions was something that we've been dealing with already before. We've got the case of Mohammed Ramadan and Hussein Musi, who are still awaiting their execution. Many organizations have documented the excessive use of force, of tortures and sexual violence against those arrested. So today we are calling for the suspension of the executions concerning Mohammed Ramadan and Hussein Mosa, and to have a new trial for them. We should also have what should also be explained is each and every case of the use of torture. The citizens cannot fear their own authorities, and the Bahraini government should carry out the reforms in order to counteract such means. Thank you.
Kiitokset.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Dominic Rui de Veza for S&D.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you, Commissioner Urpilainen, for your presence here. The colleagues have already described the dire, I will say, situation of human rights in Bahrain. It's in the common resolution, so I'm not going to repeat the question of the death penalties, the situation of the human rights defenders, the situation of the women. Of course, we know there is a new leadership in the country since November of last year. Hopefully that will bring some changes, but we cannot just expect that good things will happen. We need some action from our side. And I see two main issues. First, we know, some colleagues have mentioned, that there is, we just signed a cooperation agreement, but we have not included human rights in this agreement. How come? Can you explain this to us? We know there is also a dialogue on human rights, probably running in parallel, but it's surprising that this is not included in the cooperation agreement. And second, we now have, Commissioner, a new system of sanctions, the global system just approved. Why not use it against those that are engaged in human rights violations in Bahrain?
Kiitos oikein paljon.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And now I give the floor to our colleague Jan Christoph Oetjen. You have the floor.
Vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you, Madam. Free expression is not a crime and should not be deemed as such, but that's happening in Bahrain. Since the Arab Spring in 2011, freedoms have been restricted in Bahrain. The right to demonstrate has been restricted, parties are banned, and people who have different convictions, who are from the opposition, are arrested, tortured, detained and executed. That's unacceptable. And we need to make it clear, and I'm glad that Mr. Ruiz de Veza has just said this, that in the cooperation agreement with the EU, that needs to be addressed. The human rights dialogue with Bahrain needs to address this very clearly. And the High Representative needs to make it clear to that country that we in the EU cannot accept that kind of behaviour from our partners. We would like the death penalties to be suspended. There are 20 on death row in total. The other 18 should not be enforced because the death penalty, ladies and gentlemen, is inhumane and it is a truly disgusting measure.
Kiitokset kollega.
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the Greens, I give the floor to our colleague Hanna Neumann.
Dear colleagues, more than 2/3 of the countries around the world have either abolished the death penalty or have a moratorium on it. And amongst them are countries like Morocco, Tunisia or Algeria. And until 2017, Bahrain was part of this group, with a de facto moratorium on the death penalty and no executions. But sadly, Bahrain left this coalition, and so far 6 people have been executed and dozens are on a death row, like Mohamed Ramadan and Hussein al-Musa. They report, both of them, that they were tortured into confessions, and both of them are at imminent risk of execution. This is a very dramatic situation, and it is a clear violation of international human rights standards. Dear colleagues, as the chair of the delegation to the Arabian Peninsula, I really don't want the rulers of Bahrain to go down that road. I would actually rather like to see them living up to the statements that they make, describing Bahrain as a country that soon to be a champion of human rights. And that is why I reiterate our call that we have made in this parliament repeatedly to the Bahrainian authorities. Hold all executions and go back to the moratorium of death penalty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is our colleague Elżbieta Kruk from the ECR group.
Olkaa hyvä kollega.
Pani Przewodnicząca.
Madam President, in February this year, European Union and Bahrain have signed a cooperation agreement in order to strengthen their cooperation and trade and research. However, the human rights situation is extremely delicate. Freedom House, which is an NGO, says that Bahrain is one of the most oppressive countries in the Middle East, which, after the Arab Spring in 2010, brutally forced and limited civil liberties. The prisoners are being tortured. They are not given any medical help. In 2010-2020, about 50 people were sentenced to death. The authorities do not want to solve their economic and political problems, and Bahrain is not the only example of such a situation in the Middle East. However, whether our attempts to influence the situation there are a good idea, we can say today that the Arab Spring is also our failure.
Kiitos kollega Kruk.
Thank you very much. And now we'll hear the intervention from Nikolai Willumsen from the left.
Linu. Right now, Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja has been in prison for 10 years now in Bahrain, incarcerated for 10 years. He is a human rights defender. His only crime is to have launched a peaceful demonstration for democracy and freedom. And over the last 10 years, Mr. Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja has been tortured. He has gone hungry. He has not had access to a fair trial. Unfortunately, Mr. al-Khawaja is not the only person in this situation. There are approximately 50 journalists, politicians, human rights defenders who have been sentenced to death because they were using their freedom of expression rights. Therefore, we need to remember all political prisoners in Bahrain, including Mr. al-Khawaja. We haven't forgotten you. We can still see you, and we want a solution for you. And we are prepared to do that in order to step up against the dictatorship in Bahrain. We will never ever accept your oppression. The people in Bahrain have human rights. They are entitled to liberty and freedom. Thank you.
Kiitos kollega Willumsen.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Commissioner Urpilainen. Please, you have the floor.
Rouva puhemies, President, honourable members of the European Parliament. I am aware of the concerns this House has been expressing for several years in relation to the cases of death row inmates and human rights defenders, and overall on the human rights situation in Bahrain, as also proven by the number of EP resolutions on the matter. Human rights represent a core dimension of EU's engagement with Bahrain, featuring regularly in high-level meetings and annual human rights dialogues with the country. During the most recent dialogue, held less than 3 weeks ago, the overall human rights situation in the country was comprehensively discussed, including specific issues such as the right to fair trial and death penalty, as well as freedom of expression and association. Moreover, the recent visit of the Foreign Minister of Bahrain to Brussels offered the opportunity to emphasise the importance of human rights as a key element of EU-Bahrain relations. It also allowed to High Representative Vice President Borrell to raise several cases of imprisoned activists and human rights defenders pleading for a solution, including on humanitarian grounds. We reiterated publicly the EU's principled position against the death penalty. The EU has consistently been encouraging Bahrain to introduce a moratorium on executions as a first step towards abolition. The EU remains actively engaged on all these cases. The intensification of dialogue with Bahrain in the past months will hopefully lead to an improvement of the overall human rights situation in the country, permitting to build a more inclusive society through reform and outreach. For this purpose, we have started sharing EU expertise and best practices in specific human rights related domains with authorities in Panama. We will continue to push in this field, and you can rest assured.
Kiitos komission jäsenelle tästä.
Thank you very much for the Commissioner for this intervention. And now this debate is closed. The vote will be held today, and we'll move